In the autumn of 1898, an old man lay dying in a quiet house in California. His name had once filled the front pages of every major newspaper in the country. Senators had quoted him. Presidents had cursed him. For one strange and forgotten moment in American history, he had stood almost alone against the most powerful financial idea of the modern age. And now, with his breath failing and his hands trembling on the bedsheets, he asked his family to come closer. He had something to tell them before he died. What he said in that room has been buried for more than 100 years. It does not appear in any official biography. It is not in the law school textbooks. It is not in the records of the Supreme Court, where he once cast a vote that shook the nation. But according to the private letters of his family, what he whispered in those final hours was a warning about a tax, a warning about a country that was about to sign away something it would never get back. His name was Stephen Johnson Field, and to understand his deathbed words, you have to understand what he had spent his life fighting. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Field was born in 1816 to a strict Connecticut family. He grew up in the long shadow of the American founders. His older brother, David Dudley Field, would become one of the most influential legal reformers in American history. Stephen himself rode west during the gold rush, built a reputation in the rough mining camps of California, and rose to become Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court before he was 40. In 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln appointed him to the Supreme Court of the United States. He would serve there for 34 years, longer than almost any justice in American history. And during those decades, he would watch his country change in ways that horrified him. Field believed in something the modern world has almost forgotten. He believed that the purpose of government was not to take, but to protect. He believed that a man's labor belonged to that man, and that the fruits of that labor belonged to him also. He believed that the moment a government claimed the right to reach directly into a citizen's earnings, to measure them, to weigh them, and to take a portion before that citizen had even held the money in his own hands, something fundamental had changed. The relationship between citizen and state had reversed. The servant had become the master. And once that reversal happened, Field believed it could never be undone by ordinary means. It would only grow. It would only deepen. It would only spread. This was not a popular view, even in his own time. By the late 1800s, the United States was changing fast. The Civil War had created a massive federal debt. Railroads were crossing the continent. Great fortunes were being built in steel, in oil, in banking, and a growing chorus of voices was demanding that the rich be made to pay. The argument sounded reasonable. It sounded fair. It sounded like simple justice. Why should a farmer in Kansas pay tariffs on every plow while a millionaire in New York paid almost nothing on his vast income? The answer, said the reformers, was a tax on income itself, a direct tax that would reach into every wallet, but would only really hurt the wealthy. That, at least, was the promise. In 1894, Congress passed such a tax. It applied only to incomes above $4,000 a year, which at the time meant only the wealthiest 1 or 2% of Americans. Most citizens would never pay a cent, but Stephen Johnson Field, now nearly 80 years old and the senior member of the Supreme Court, looked at that law and saw something the reformers did not see. He saw the door opening. He saw the precedent being set. And he understood with the clarity of a man who had watched governments for half a century that once the principle was accepted, the numbers would not stay small. The threshold would drop. The rates would rise. The exemptions would shrink. What began as a tax on the rich would, within a generation, become a tax on everyone. He had seen it happen in Europe. He believed with every fibre of his being that it must not happen here. The case came before the Supreme Court in 1895. It was called Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company, and it would become one of the most controversial decisions in the court's history. The question was whether the income tax of 1894 violated the Constitution, which required that direct taxes be apportioned among the states according to population. Field, in his concurring opinion, did not limit himself to dry legal reasoning. He wrote with the urgency of a man delivering a warning to future generations. He wrote that the present assault upon capital was but the beginning. It would be, he said, the stepping stone to others, larger and more sweeping, until the country's political contests would become a war of the poor against the rich. He used those exact words, a war of the poor against the rich. He believed the income tax was not merely unconstitutional. He believed it was socially dangerous. He believed it would teach Americans to look at their neighbours with envy instead of with respect. The court, by a narrow margin of 5-4, struck down the income tax. Field had won, but he knew, even as the decision was being read, that the victory would not last. He retired from the court in 1897, an old and exhausted man. He moved into a quiet house surrounded by his books and his memories. He watched as the country he had tried to protect kept marching in the direction he had warned against. Reformers in both parties began calling for a constitutional amendment that would do what the court had refused to allow. They wanted the power to tax incomes directly, without apportionment, without limit, without the old protections the founders had built into the document. Field watched it all from his quiet house, and he saw the amendment coming the way a man on a hill sees a storm gathering over the plain. He died on the 9th of April 1899 at his home before the amendment was even drafted in Congress. That document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Yet in the family papers, in the letters his nieces and his nephews kept among their private collections, there is a record of what he said in those final weeks. And here we must pause, because the historical record is fragile here. Some of what follows comes from family letters that were not published until decades later. Some comes from the reminiscences of clerks and friends who visited him in his final months. The picture they paint is consistent, even if no single source can be considered definitive. And that picture is the picture of a man who knew exactly what he was looking at, and who tried in his last hours to warn the people he loved. According to one account preserved by a relative, Field told his family that they would live to see the day when no honest man in America could keep what he had earned. He said the tax would start small, on the very rich, and the people would cheer. He said it would creep down year by year until it reached the man who worked with his hands. He said the government would learn to spend in proportion to what it could take, and what it could take would have no fixed limit. He said the citizen would no longer feel that his property was his own. He said the country would change in ways that no one in his generation could imagine. And then, according to the same account, he is said to have looked at his family and said something very simple. He told them to teach their children to remember what the country had been before, because once it was gone, he said, it would not come back in their lifetime, or perhaps in any lifetime. These are not the words of a man predicting the end of the world. Field was not a doomsayer. He was a careful, dry, deeply read jurist who had spent 40 years reading the constitutional histories of nations. He had watched the British income tax, originally a temporary wartime measure, become permanent and grow steadily through the 19th century. He understood that taxes, once accepted in principle, almost never retreat. They only advance. He understood that the political class, once given a new instrument of revenue, almost never sets it down. He understood that the citizens, once accustomed to a deduction from their wages, almost never demand its full return. The habit becomes the law, and the law becomes the assumption, and the assumption becomes invisible. By the time anyone notices, it is too late. This is why his deathbed words carry such weight for those who have heard them. He was not warning about the tax itself, he was warning about the silent transformation it would produce in the soul of a free people. He believed that liberty was not a single grand thing that could be defended with armies. He believed that liberty lived in 1,000 small daily transactions, in the simple confidence that what a man earned was his, in the quiet dignity of holding the fruit of his own labour in his own hand. Once that confidence was broken, once the citizen had to ask permission of the government to keep his own bread, the structure of liberty had been hollowed out. Even if the outer forms remained, the flag would still fly. The elections would still be held. The newspapers would still be printed. But something at the centre would be gone, and most people would not even notice that it was missing. The 16th Amendment passed, as Field had predicted, in 1913. The first modern income tax law was signed by President Woodrow Wilson the same year. It was a small tax. It applied only to the wealthy. The top rate was 7%. Almost no ordinary American paid it. The promise was that it would stay that way. The promise was that the working man would never feel it. The promise was the same promise that had been made in 1894. By 1918, just 5 years later, the top rate had reached 77%. The number of Americans paying the tax had grown enormously. By the Second World War, withholding from the paycheck had been introduced, a system that took the money before the citizen ever held it. The $4,000 threshold of 1894 had become a memory. The narrow class of payers had become almost everyone. The temporary measure had become a permanent fixture. The exception had become the rule. And Stephen Johnson Field, in his quiet grave, had been right. He had been right about the rates. He had been right about the reach. He had been right about the political incentive that would drive each new generation of lawmakers to extend the tax further. He had been right about the way it would change the relationship between citizen and government. He had been right about the way Americans would adapt, would accept, would eventually forget that there had ever been another way to live. He had been right about all of it, and almost no one remembered that he had warned them. There is something haunting about a prophecy that comes true so completely that no one notices the prophet. Field is barely known today. His name appears in legal histories as a footnote, a conservative jurist of the Gilded Age, often dismissed as a defender of corporate interests against the rising tide of progressive reform. His warnings about the income tax are quoted occasionally by libertarian scholars, but the wider culture has forgotten him almost entirely. The textbooks teach the 16th Amendment as a triumph of fairness. They do not teach the dissenting voice. They do not teach what was lost when the amendment passed. They do not teach the deathbed warning of the old judge who saw, with painful clarity, what was coming. A free people who knew their history would find his warning unbearable. They would have to ask whether they had quietly accepted something their grandparents would have refused. They would have to ask whether the men of 1916, who still remembered a country without an income tax, would recognize the country of today. These are not comfortable questions. It is easier to forget the man who asked them. And yet, one can almost picture the scene in that bedroom in 1899. The old judge, his white hair thin on the pillow, his hands folded over the sheet, his family sitting beside him, leaning close, trying to catch every word, the clock ticking somewhere in the hallway, and Field, with the last of his strength, telling them to remember, to teach their children, to pass it on, to keep alive in some small corner of the family memory the knowledge of what the country had been before the great change came. He did not expect to stop the change. He had given up that hope. He only hoped that someone somewhere would remember that it had been a change at all, that there had been another America, and that another America was at least conceivable. That memory is what he gave his family in his last hours. And now, more than a century later, that memory is given to you, not as a call to political action, not as an argument for any policy, only as the recovery of a forgotten voice, only as the simple historical fact that there was once a Supreme Court Justice of the United States who looked at the income tax and saw with absolute clarity what it would do to his country. He spoke. The family kept the words, the historians forgot them, the country moved on. The tax grew, and somewhere in a quiet archive the deathbed warning of Stephen Johnson Field still waits for anyone curious enough to listen. You have listened tonight. That is no small thing.